Well, hey there, art nerds. Today I am finally field testing the Supervision watercolors that I unboxed and swatched a while back. I had really high hopes for these watercolors. They have beautiful, vibrant colors, and I've really come to love Supervision's super granulating watercolors, and I have a field test for those coming up for you guys soon too. So if you're interested in Supervision, I've got a lot of Supervision stuff coming up. For those of you who don't know, I purchased these Supervision watercolors off of AliExpress a while back from the Dai boutique store. I'll have a link in the description as well as full show notes in the description for those of you who like to read while you listen, or maybe you just want a little additional information. You can check the description for that. And I'm also going to link the original unboxing swatch in the description as well as in the card. So if you're curious about these watercolors, you want to learn more about the company, more about the palette itself, I hope you guys will check out the unboxing swatch. But today we are finally putting them to the test. This is the anniversary set. It comes with 12 plus 2 colors. So you get a pretty basic selection of colors plus a couple of more unusual ones. And to begin with, I am spritzing them with a little bit of clean water in a spritzer bottle to allow them to pre-activate. So the materials that I am using today, in addition to our Supervision watercolors, is I am painting on Stonehenge Coldpress Aqua watercolor paper. This is an affordable cotton rag paper that I use for a lot of these field tests because I can predict how paints generally will handle on it. I really like it, and it's a very accessible paper. I did a review and a comparison where I not only reviewed the individual Stonehenge hot and cold presses, but then I compared them head to head to help you find a watercolor paper that might work for you. So if you're interested in watercolor painting, I not only hope that you'll check that out, but I hope you guys will check out my Watercolor Basics series and my Watercolor 101 playlist, particularly for people who are new to watercolor. If you're more interested in finding great, affordable, maybe professional grade paints to add to your collection, I've got tons of great watercolor reviews. I've got a playlist for that. I will link that in the description below as well as in the cards. So if you're on the market for great watercolors, I hope you'll check those out as well. This was inked with a Sakura Pigma FB brush pen, so that is a waterproof and alcohol marker proof brush pen, and it is one of the illustrations from Lilliputian Living 2020. If you guys like my art, if you're curious about learning more about the Lilliputian world, you can purchase your own copy of Lilliputian Living, which contains volumes 1 through 4, which were yearly Lilliputian world building prompts. So it's a really charming book with black and white illustrations combined with some prose text. You can order that and help support the work that I do by getting it through the Natto-shop at nattosoup.com/shop. And of course, I'll put a link in the description for that as well. So the first thing I tried to mix up was a kind of warm golden color, mixing the two yellows that we had no real problem there. Then I tried to mix a Payne's gray using ultramarine and burnt sienna, and I noticed that it really separates out, with the ultramarine being the most noticeable. I have also noticed that many of these colors granulate a lot, and that can make them a bit tricky to use for illustration as they fall out of solution quickly, or they leave large chunks of pigment behind. And this is particularly noticeable with both the yellow ochre and the burnt sienna, so this is going to come up a lot when I'm mixing skin tones and wood tones. Now, before we dive super deep into this field test, I do have a little bit of shopkeeping to kind of get out of the way before we get in here. So first off, this video has been time-lapsed several times. There are chunks that are time-lapsed by 2, chunks that are time-lapsed by 4, and even chunks that are time-lapsed by 6 and 8. No one paints this fast. I've also edited out any of the dry time. So an illustration like this would take me a couple days, maybe 3 days. I work in Louisiana, so it really kind of depends on the humidity. But if you're watching this and you're looking for some watercolor inspiration, some watercolor tips, I do feel like I have to disclose that to you guys. In all fairness, I've encountered so many people who are coming from digital art, or maybe they're new to art, or they're new to watercolor, who are not really familiar with the dry time or just how long watercolor can take. For me, it's one of the faster mediums. I really love watercolor. It is a delight, and I do a lot of work in watercolor, including all of my comic 7-inch Cara in watercolor. But there are some hiccups that might not make it the best medium for you. So even though this is time-lapsed and I've edited out a lot of the dry time, and maybe you don't necessarily see me struggling with some things, I do want to disclose that I have years of painting experience behind my belt. I'm a watercolor comic artist and sometimes illustrator. I have a lot of watercolor experience, so I might handle the paints differently than a watercolor fine artist might handle them, or someone who paints more from reference, or someone who just has a different art style than I do. Every artist handles the medium a little bit differently, and that's one of the things I really love about art, and I really love about watercolor. But I do want to disclose it because I think it's only fair to point that out so you guys have as much information as possible. On that note, if you'd like to check out more of my art, it really means a lot to me. You can read 7-inch Kara for free as a webcomic at 7inchkara.com. But if you're not into webcomics, if you like dead tree format, you can also purchase the first and second volumes of my beautiful watercolor webcomic from the Natto-shop at nattosoup.com/shop. And if you'd just like to check out my art or see what I'm working on, you can follow me. I hope you will. Follow me over on Instagram at instagram.com/nattosoup. So back to the watercolors. Many of these colors granulate a lot, which makes them kind of tricky to use. And as I'm painting, I notice that some of the colors tend to get really goopy and opaque. They tend to just glob onto my paintbrush. This makes it difficult to use them delicately or to grab just a little bit of color. I'm not talking about mass tone saturation either. I'm talking about pigment and binder just globbing up onto the brush, even if you very gently dip it into the palette. And this is something that I actually noticed years ago when I was reviewing Prima Watercolors and the Jane Davenport watercolors. Sometimes with cheaper watercolors, this can be a problem. So it's something I want to point out, because if you are expecting the ability to very delicately mix colors, you are going to have to adjust your paint style just a bit for these. And although these are studio paints, they get used very quickly, which is very similar to problems that I've had with student grade paint, where there might be a lot of filler included to kind of extend the paints and to make them look brighter. I wonder if that's what's going on with this palette as well. They also fall out of solution very quickly, especially the burnt sienna, which requires frequent remixing. I'm talking about every time you dip the brush into your paint remixing, not just, every 20 minutes kind of remixing. It's honestly a little bit frustrating and quite different from most of the other watercolors that I've used in the past. Does this make them bad paints though? No, not necessarily, but it's something to keep in mind, especially if you're familiar with other brands. So I'm doing a lot of my color mixing on an inexpensive ceramic plate. I picked this up at Dollar Tree. I use this as a mixing palette all the time. It works particularly well for standalone illustrations like this, where I don't need to mix up a big batch of the color, or I'm not going to be using the same color over and over and over again. I did find that I was able to re-wet the colors pretty easily on this plate, and this might be why some of the colors are falling out of solution pretty quickly, is there's just really not a lot of water. I'm not using a lot of paint here, so it might just be quicker evaporation. It might be a little bit faster for them to fall out of solution. So if you paint differently than this, if you have a different style, if you use the materials differently, you may not have these same problems. I really love these during the first 2 unbox and swatch videos, but I'm kind of annoyed with these paints. The colors are still bright and saturated, but they're a bit annoying to mix, especially grays using burnt sienna and ultramarine blue. The granulation on colors I commonly use for skin tones is also frustrating. It leaves a graininess on skin tone mixes, which is the absolute worst time for graininess in my opinion when you work small like I do. I am used to yellow ochres having some opacity, and I know how to deal with that, but the large chunks of pigments are kind of a new issue for me when it comes to yellow ochres. Now I am working on a paper that has a fair amount of surface tooth. Stonehenge's Coldpress has a nice distinct texture and it really does invite a lot of granulation. My concern would be if I were painting on a hot press paper, all that granulation, all that sedimentation, all those chunks of pigments would just sit on the paper surface rather than kind of settling into the nooks and crannies. So I think even if I worked with a paper that wasn't so prone to granulation, so inviting for granulation, I would still have some of these issues and concerns that I'm having with this cold press paper. I also paint on cold press paper almost predominantly. I do paint on hot press on occasion, but I mostly paint on cold press paper. And this is more pronounced of an issue with these paints than I've noticed even with other Chinese watercolor paints like the Paul Rubens paints from the tubes. I haven't had those issues with those paints. So that's why I'm bringing it up. It's more noticeable to me as I'm handling it. It may not be as noticeable if you're watching it. I'm kind of zoomed out. You can see the whole of it. I'm also trying to use all of the colors in the palette, which is why I chose this illustration for this field test. It's a Lilliputian artist painting on a canvas, so lots of bright colors. I thought it'd be a great use for the colors in this palette. And while it is, it's hard to overlook some of the issues and some of the struggles that I'm having with these paints. And I mentioned this earlier, but these really do kind of remind me of the Prima and Jane Davenport paints. Those are actually drop shipped. Those are made by Mungyo, I believe, and then rebranded as Prima and Jane Davenport, which is why in the past I had such a glaring problem with their price point, is they were way overpriced for what you were getting. These are more affordably priced, although they're more difficult to find. This is an anniversary set, and Supervision is still offering these watercolors, but in different configurations. I believe it's the larger sets that are more commonly available. So while I can't link you to this exact product, I will link you to similar products from AliExpress that are available at this time. And I will try to get as close an approximation for the price point as possible. So check the description for that. So as a watercolor comic artist and illustrator, I paint a lot of people. They're kind of my main focus. I do a lot of floral studies, but my heart lies in painting people and designing characters. So it really matters to me when I can't mix skin tones that I deem appropriate and that I deem usable. So this palette might be great for somebody else who paints larger than I do, who paints different subject matter than I do, but for someone who paints a lot of people fairly small, there are some glaring issues that are a little bit difficult for me to get over. As I said before, it's really challenging to mix skin tones because these paints fall out of solution so quickly. This would be an even bigger problem if I was mixing up darker skin tones, where it's really important that the colors don't fall out of solution immediately so that I can build up glazes and I can build up shadows and I can build up contrast. With lighter skin tones like this, it's still a problem, and the graininess is a big problem too. As you can see, her face is drawn fairly small, and if you have a lot of granulation on a face this small, it starts to look muddy. It starts to look like it was poorly rendered or poorly handled. And you know, as the artist, I do have to take some responsibility for that, but as someone who paints a lot of people at this size frequently, in fact, for many of my field tests, I've been doing pages from Lilliputian Living, I think it's safe for me to be able to point out when these are an issue because I've been doing this consistently for a while now, and I have a large area to kind of compare to. I have several paints, several illustrations that I can compare this one to and be able to be the judge of that. Now, do I think Supervision is going to listen to my feedback and make adjustments? Absolutely not. I have no expectation of that. They are a Chinese watercolor brand. They have a totally different market. I am probably not at all the market that they had in mind. But if I can help other watercolor artists when they are selecting paints to purchase, when they are looking for paints that will suit their needs, I am more than happy to do so. And there are plenty of other watercolor artists here on YouTube who do all sorts of work. But I've been painting watercolor comics for more than 10 years. I have a lot of experience with that. And I have dedicated the past 5, maybe 6 years of my life to finding paints that work really well for that purpose. So would I use these for my watercolor comics? No, I would not. I also noticed that it can be very challenging to get strong enough mixes. Whether it's skin tones or purples, everything mixes just kind of weak, which is a big frustration point because then it's difficult to build up contrast. It's difficult to build up shadows. It's difficult to build up those colors. And for an artist like me, I use a lot of layers to build up what I'm going for, so that's just not really going to work for me. I can start to tell that there's some optical brighteners at play. These are used to make the mass tone of the color look brighter, more appealing. It makes it easier to sell the watercolors, but it doesn't make them easier to work with, and it doesn't make them more of a pleasure to work with either, as the colors lighten the area but don't actually add color. And I'm comparing this against the Paul Rubens tubes that I reviewed recently. They offer some opacity and a lot of color vibrancy, but they also allow for a lot of layering. They are also Chinese watercolors that I purchased from AliExpress or are easily purchased on AliExpress. They are the Chinese watercolors that most people are now familiar with because they're very popular with good reason, and they're at a similar price point to the Supervision colors. So I figure if you are looking at Supervision, you've probably also considered Paul Rubens, and I'm going to link my Paul Rubens review and field test in the description so you guys can compare them. But at this point, if you work like I do, if your work is kind of similar to mine, I would say go with the Paul Rubens watercolors over the Supervision watercolors, or at least this Supervision set. There are Supervision watercolors that I will highly recommend, and those are coming up in another field test. But for this, I think you could probably skip this set. Now, there are some pros to Supervision watercolors. Now, one of my concerns is I'm in the US. I ordered them from AliExpress. I didn't see them in a brick and mortar store. It's not like I was supporting a local business, and I did have to wait a while for them to come, several weeks in fact. So that definitely factors into this review. If I lived in a country where Supervision watercolors were available and accessible and very affordable, I would still have a lot of the complaints that I'm bringing forward here, but I might still be able to recommend them for somebody who works a lot larger than I do. You know, there would be other factors in play. I might have paid less. They might have been easier to get. So there might be other use cases that spring to mind because they might fit that niche. But as it is, they're basically in the same niche as the Paul Rubens watercolors, and the Paul Rubens watercolors are quite a bit more accessible than the Supervision watercolors because you can get them through Amazon. You don't have to wait all this time, and they also handle a lot better, and you can get the Paul Rubens tubes. And while you can get Supervision tubes, and maybe the Supervision tubes handle a lot better than their half pan counterparts, I've actually seen that in a few instances. All I can go by right now are the half pans here. Now, in all fairness, I also didn't like the Paul Rubens half pans when I reviewed them years ago. So maybe in a couple years, it'll be worth it for me to revisit Supervision in tube form and see if those handle any better. Of course, if you'd like to see that happen sooner rather than later, I do purchase pretty much everything I review either out of pocket or using funds raised from my Patreon. So if you enjoy my work, if you want to help support my work, and if you enjoy these reviews, you can help ensure that I continue to review art supplies and watercolors by joining me at patreon.com/Natto-shop. So for her jumper, I wanted this kind of ultramarine violet sort of mix. So I mixed ultramarine with magenta, which normally makes a really gorgeous kind of purple, and it did make a really pretty purple here, but it falls out of solution so quickly. You have to keep remixing it. It's just kind of difficult to control these watercolors, and not in a fun, exciting way, but in a I'm fighting the media kind of way. I'm fighting the material kind of way, and it always makes it hard for me to recommend something when I felt like I kind of fought with it the whole time, when I have to actively think about how to get it to do what I want it to do. So once I got my base colors kind of established, I switched over to a smaller multi-weld ceramic palette that allows me to mix up larger batches of certain colors and try to keep those colors consistent, particularly with skin, hair, and clothing colors. So this, I was mixing up larger batches, I was using more water, I was using more pigment, and I was still having those issues with weird graininess, weird sedimentation, and colors falling out of solution. So I think it's just kind of a pervasive problem. It might be a pervasive problem with the Supervision half pans. It might be a more pervasive problems with these specific colors like the yellow ochres, the burnt siennas, the ultramarines, and ultramarines already granulate. But this was even more challenging than some of the other brands that I've used in the past. And maybe it has to do with the binder they're using. Maybe it has to do with some of the additives and fillers that they're using. I really couldn't say, but it was just a little bit more difficult and a little bit more frustrating to use than many of the other watercolors that I've used in the past. I really think there's a lot of optical brighteners going on in here to make the colors really bright and fun and inviting, and that's something they wouldn't necessarily add to tube watercolors because that's not as important. But you guys let me know what you think's going on in the comments below. I want to hear from you guys. Do you like Supervision watercolors? Do you paint with them often? I would love to hear from people who use these paints, love these paints, and swear by these paints because I'm always interested in an alternate opinion. Of course, I also keep in mind that I know artists who can use Crayola washable watercolors to beautiful effect. And no matter how hard I try, I cannot. So sometimes it's really all about finding the right material for you, what you like, and what works for you. So at this point, I've pulled out some white gouache to add some white highlights. So I'm going to talk about my verdict for the Supervision watercolors. So while I like the Supervision watercolors decently well, I think their real appeal comes from their more unusual offerings. While I initially really liked how Supervision watercolors swatched in the 2 unbox and swatch videos, the field test showed me that I don't really like how these handle. In this instance, I won't chalk it up to user error or my own preferences, but to some strange choices made by Supervision and how some of the colors are produced. If you want to try Chinese watercolors, I can recommend Paul Rubens over the regular Supervision watercolors, but I do recommend you try out the Supervision super granulating watercolors as well. I find the professional Supervision watercolors handle more like student grade watercolors, so I'd be curious to try their studio version and compare the two. I'd also be interested in trying out their tube watercolors and comparing them to their half pans, because sometimes when I use tube watercolors in half pans and let them dry, I tend to like them way better than the actual half pan watercolors produced by that company. So since there seems to be some optical brighteners added to these, they're not as transparent as I would hope. So they did add some muddiness to the line art. So I'm re-inking it a little bit to reestablish that clarity, to add that contrast back in and to just clean up those lines. Now I have to do this kind of depending on the brand anyway. Brands that have more opaque colors, this needs to be done just to kind of reestablish all that contrast. Brands that have more transparent colors or that I handled really lightly, I don't have to do this. So even with watercolors that I really love and use all the time and swear by, sometimes this is just a necessary thing that happens, but I felt like I had to do that with these Supervision watercolors rather than it was more of a choice. So that's also another detriment. This had already been inked and now I have to re-ink it for clarity. So just to reiterate, while I like the Supervision watercolors in general, I have actually purchased some of their plant-based watercolors to give those a try as well. I've tried out their mineral-based watercolors, I've tried out their super granulating watercolors, and of course we have tried out their studio watercolors today. I can't really recommend the studio set to my friends who are interested in watercolor for illustration or for comics. If you're looking for affordable watercolors from AliExpress, I can highly recommend the Paul Rubens watercolors. I think you guys will be a lot happier with those than you would be with these. But I have not tried the Supervision Tube Studio watercolors, so that might be an upcoming video. So I hope you guys found today's field test to be helpful, useful, and informative. If you enjoyed it, leave me a big old thumbs up and let me know what watercolors you guys would like to see me review in the future down in the comments below. I have the show notes in the description as well as links to everything that we talked about in this video. And if you like what I do and you'd like to help support it, why don't you guys consider clicking the subscribe button and telling YouTube to notify you when my channel updates. I hope you guys have a wonderful day, and a huge thanks to my amazing patrons.